Thanks for taking the time to attend the session. Today, I want to talk with you a little bit about COVID-19 and the pandemic and how it's impacted organizations and some things you can do to prevent attackers and fraud in your organization. Hopefully this information over the next few minutes will be helpful as you go back to your organizations and assess where you fall in that maturity. So over the next few minutes, I'm going to talk a little bit about organizational readiness. How were we ready, if we were ready, for the pandemic and the change to the new norm and the new operational model? What the future looks like, and a renewed focus in some areas, some of those challenges around those areas, and then some steps you can take to reduce the overall risks associated to that. And then finally, I'm going to talk a little bit about communication, a different approach in communicating risk and using quantitative analysis to tell the story and change the language and the message on how we communicate to leaders. So with that, even though you did a great introduction for me, Judy, I'll just say a little bit about myself. Like you mentioned, over 2 decades of experience in technology, working in multiple industries, transportation, financial services, all heavily regulated. So I go through the regulation experience and the regulatory experience a lot. As a senior director and of data privacy and IT and compliance, I'm responsible for the oversight and the strategy and direction of the Ally Privacy Office program, and ensuring we are compliant, also that we are compliant with the federal and state regulations, i.e. GDPR, CCPA, and NYDFS. So I have several years of experience of building programs like that and managing, operationalizing programs related in those fields. So a lot of this context will help as you look at the next few slides. You'll see contextually why we've done things the way we've done things around basic principles. So let's talk a little bit about the readiness. How ready were we when this pandemic hit? I think most of us in this industry would say we probably weren't ready, but I think it's interesting to note some of the numbers that have been reported out. So when you think about cyber attacks have skyrocketed over the last few months. I mean, according to the FBI Cyber Division, they're up 400%, which is not really shocking, but when you start looking at some of those numbers, it is a little alarming, because then you start thinking about what's the consequence or the end result of that. The next thing that was interesting, obviously, was phishing attacks. So we see phishing attacks growing up 250%, jumping from 149,000 to 522,000 in just in March and April. So those numbers are continually going up. And then lastly, kind of concerning, was that only 10% of the organizations were actually prepared for the coronavirus when we think about business continuity. So that was interesting to me as well, only 10%. So with that, this is an attacker's, what I would call, holy grail. You think about all these great presentations we've been seeing prior to this, it's all about that attack surface. And you think about, as we continue to increase our infrastructure to support the demand of the new norm, remote workers, a pandemic of this scale, and phishing campaigns associated, or social engineering campaigns associated, and teams not staffed to support, and in some cases reduced staff. So remember, attackers will use the path of least resistance, which is people, especially as security increases. So think about that contextually as we go through the next few slides. I think you'll find that interesting. So next, let's talk a little bit about what the future looks like. And I think it's no surprise to most of us in this industry that, due to the new norm, all of these areas, I believe, will have a renewed focus due to the pandemic. So what does the workforce look like? I think going forward, you're going to see more remote workers, organizations, more telecommuting. Organizations are starting to see that they can be productive with a remote workforce and this new norm. There's also financial benefits from this model and a competitive edge that organizations are going to start using as they hire staff. This will only increase in demand. More people are going to be looking for opportunities. There's more of a demand out there due to this. So all in all, it's just a perfect cycle of challenges for the future as a renewed focus on a remote workforce. When you think about the next thing, which is really about phishing campaigns, which we mentioned earlier, those are going to continue to go up. I think there's going to be a renewed focus on how we manage to that. The numbers are continually growing due to the circumstances. I think phishing attacks and credential harvesting will be significantly harder to manage, especially when personal equipment is being used and staff are not completely relying on a virtual contact experience. That will be something in the future that we'll see more oversight and more management around. And again, I think we all experience the phishing campaigns internally. You know, how do we prevent that? How do we educate users? How do we keep them informed about what's going on out there from a social engineering landscape? I think the next thing that will continue to be a challenge for us, or not really a challenge, but just an oversight, is data privacy. Data privacy, we're already seeing states like California, New York, Washington adopt their own cybersecurity and data privacy laws, which require new technologies, programs, and people to support. In this space, data management will be key in supporting such regulations. We're going to start seeing more of this. I think CCPA is just the beginning of it. More states are already doing their things right now, like NYDFS with their cybersecurity, oversight and requirements and regulations. So this is going to be something in the future and a new focus, an additional focus around how data is managed. Next, a little bit about cloud management. Obviously, we're all moving to the cloud. Most of us are going at a much faster pace than others. The pandemic has changed that and even pushed even more acceleration around that. And as organizations are adapting to the new business continuity plans or business demands to be more digital, cloud's certainly going to play a part. What's key here is that as we think about this renewed focus on clouds, cloud management will be an essential piece of monitoring that and oversight. And again, I mentioned data management and governance will have to have a seat, I think, at the table in terms of oversight and approving for all data in motion and at rest or in use. Organizations need to understand what that catalog looks like, if you will. So cloud management will be definitely a part of that. And then last, something that's a little different, still somewhat in, I wouldn't say it's infancy, but still relatively new, which I think is identity intel. I think you're going to start seeing organizations beginning to understand how do they use that information to stop the cyber and fraud that are going on in terms of organizations and how they deal with it. Monitoring routines will incorporate this kind of data into their programs. So with that, the future looks a little bit like this. And I think it's a renewed focus in these areas. So next, let's talk a little bit about the challenges. So business functions. So when you think about how do we understand what our remote workforce looks like, business functions have to be a part of that discussion and understanding what those requirements are for remote workers. So I think the challenge here is trying to understand what those functions are and make sure that we have those documented and identified for what the workforce looks like. Secondly, again, I'll mention data management. I mean, data management is going to be key, and traditionally these are disjointed type of operational models. Making sure that there is a complete application and data catalog for understanding where data elements reside, understanding the classifications of those stores or those applications, and if protection controls are enabled. Again, any type of risks with a remote workforce having unnecessary access to data elements like social security numbers, date of birth. This is key for understanding, and traditionally it's been disjointedly managed by multiple different teams. So this is something that I think organizations will have to dedicate resources, time, programs to fully understanding what that landscape looks like. Next, third parties. This is traditionally, organizations have third-party management programs. However, I think there's going to have to be more depth in those programs going forward. And what I mean by that is truly understanding what third parties, is, again, we're all working from home, we're all telecommuting, but what does that mean now that we've allowed third parties to also be remote, to also work and see data and access data. And in some cases, this is, a supplier's data, and it could be consumer information. So I think a lack of documentation around what third parties are doing in terms of the services and what they have access to, and do they need to have that access, and what elements can they see in clear text. I think all of that's going to play in a part of the discussion. And the challenge here with it is who's going to own that? Who's going to put that together in terms of, is that a third-party management challenge, or is that a business challenge, or is that a data security challenge? So again, thinking about all these disjointed, organizational teams that do this, that's part of the challenge, is how do we get there? And then, of course, the other challenge is internally, one of those being networks. Obviously, with keeping up with the infrastructure and demands on the network, along with the remote workforce that will need additional guidance and policies and standards when working from home. Also securing their home networks, routers, along with restrictions for printing and USB and DLP, all of these play a part in the monitoring of those endpoints. So the challenge is, how do we keep up with that? Now that we've moved, in some cases, 100% to a remote workforce, that requires more staff, that requires more oversight, that requires more monitoring. So I think this is just a continually evolving area of challenges in terms of how do we manage it. And then the next part of this, I talked a little bit about, which was analytics and behavior. So as I mentioned earlier, the staff not being used to a virtual Connect experience will be more likely to make mistakes. Therefore, being able to monitor the behavior will be a challenge. Building behavior analytics platforms and teams requires infrastructure, requires teams, requires support services, a lot of that. And a lack of formality around this type of work will create challenges. But this is what I think is, going to be key for, as we move forward and try to understand that intelligence, we need to have those type of teams stood up and managed. There's more of a demand to collect the information related to user behavior and to stop the bad actors. More infrastructure, more staff, and there's already a competition to meet the infrastructure demands to the new norm. These are things that we need to make sure that are prioritized and raised to the top of the list. Next, and finally, risk assessments. I think these challenges, all coupled together with the speed at which we're trying to keep up with the demand, create toxic combinations for us. How do we keep this in scope and continually to have risk assessments performed and perform risk exceptions and managed to appropriately, and making sure that they're remediated based on industry best practices, following any type of cybersecurity frameworks, privacy frameworks. All of these things need to be addressed. And traditionally, remediation is the one thing that I think falls off. In some cases, we're great at documenting it. Some cases, in some ways, we're great at getting it approved. But it's the remediation challenge that I think that needs to be addressed, and how do we perform these assessments more meaningfully? And I'll get to more of that later on, and that's really around the communication of this. So those are kind of the challenges that I see for us. And then let's talk a little bit about some of the steps that we can take to get to managing to the new norm of a remote workforce. So as I mentioned earlier, identifying business functions. This is going to be key for us as we try to understand what that new remote workforce looks like and how we're preventing bad actors and fraud or cyber attacks internally, insiders, or externally. So I think it's important that we're identifying and documenting those business functions. Next, consider establishing a data management team, program, process to always repeatedly, routinely scan, catalog, classify, so you have a true source of information. This will be key as you start building out the governance around it. Without a source of information like this, it becomes more of a challenge for the message. Again, I go back to the traditionally, it's somewhat disjointed in its management style in the past, historically. You have DBAs involved, you have business involved, you have security people involved. And in some cases, all of this means nobody really owns it end to end. So that's why I believe, and we've been successful at building those type of programs to make sure that we have an objective viewpoint of what that experience should be like. Next, again, it's about the controls, it's about understanding what you have, it's about protecting that data, making sure that based on security standards and policies that you've set, that you evaluate if there are sensitive data stores that require certain protections applied. Again, it's always about that governance side of it and making sure that, this is key as you try to apply those rules and comply with those rules. And then next, as I mentioned earlier, establish a routine and a cadence for communicating those controls, those control gaps, and making sure that the protections, again, are consistent and that they are following published guidelines and regulatory requirements. And then 5, respond and remediate. I focus a lot on remediation because it's one of the areas that I feel, that without dedicated resources to really follow through with that and have an accountability to it, it's the one thing that seems to traditionally be a missed opportunity. So create a repository, an approval process, and an owner to following through with remediation, and making sure that we are not traditionally checking, routinely year after year a risk acceptance. And also, this is where I believe integrating quantitative analysis into the discussion to determine risk for likelihood and impact into the conversation. This is where I think we've made success and steps along the journey that have helped us immensely in terms of telling the story. So I'm going to talk a little bit about, finally, the one thing that probably helped us mostly, which was trying to make sure that we are communicating in a way that helps our business leaders make informed decisions. So when you think about how we communicate traditionally, risk, traditionally we've used qualitative analysis to help business leaders make decisions. We've used subject matter experts to help them make decisions. Senior executives have made decisions, intuition. There's multiple ways to do it. Remember, according to NIST, risk is defined as the function of a likelihood of a given threat source exercising a particular potential vulnerability and the resulting impact of that adverse event in the organization. I always say this just for context, because I think at the end of the day, our job as security leaders, privacy leaders, are to communicate in a way, in a language that helps people understand what risk is and what it means. So I've developed ways to use quantitative analysis and Monte Carlo simulations to measure risk. And again, it's changed the conversation to help business leaders make informed decisions. Again, this is the language that they need to help them. So again, that's, the way I've interpreted those things is I've been in so many meetings where when I didn't have this kind of information, the conversations always kind of lean towards the person who had the most experience, or the subject matter person who had been there the longest. So it's always been a challenge. What we've done is we've stripped away all of that. That information is important, don't get me wrong. Experience and intuition is important, but I've always believed that we can incorporate new ways into that conversation. Below is an example of one of our risk of a breach models that we created. Basically what we use is empirical data from Verizon Data Breach, Tony Mon, other research organizations, and we build out an upper, a lower, and a most likely value, again, based on that empirical data. And we run those simulations through Monte Carlo scenarios 10,000 times to come up with measurements. And it gives us about an 80 to 90% confidence interval based on the number of simulations that we run through. And this gives a financial impact for that. So anyway, that's our story a little bit. Hopefully this has been helpful. I'll pause and I'll close with, again, thank you for the time. Enjoy telling the story, and hopefully you found it helpful. And I'll take any questions if we have time.